In the heart of a bustling plaza where Chicago's wealthy elite gather, a young black girl quietly stood behind a small wooden table, selling homemade cookie boxes. Passers-by smirked. Some sneered, others shook their heads in disapproval. Then, a man approached. A billionaire. Cold. Powerful. In front of the crowd, he picked up one of the cookie boxes, gave it a light squeeze, and left. This? You think this can change anything? Less than 2 hours later, the entire city stood silent as a breaking announcement aired on the massive LED screen in the center of the plaza. The girl's small face appeared, along with a truth that left everyone speechless. But what made the crowd regret the most, wasn't what they saw. It was how they had treated the girl before knowing who she really was. Oak Ridge Square, located in the heart of Chicago, is not a place just anyone can casually step into. It's a gathering ground for the elite, where wealth doesn't need to be flaunted. Every step, every glance already commands respect. Surrounding the plaza are luxury fashion boutiques, Hermes, Chanel, Cartier, familiar names to the ultra-rich. Everything is spotless to perfection. The sidewalks are paved with imported stone, trees are trimmed like artwork, and every corner is under the watchful eye of private security cameras. People come to Oak Ridge not just to shop, but to be seen, to be acknowledged. Women pass by with flawless makeup, lips red like wine, floating with every step. Men wear Swiss watches, gray-tinted sunglasses, and speak in calm, confident tones that carry unspoken authority. Some walk their snowy white poodles, dressed in custom leather jackets. In that luxurious and prideful setting, Aubrey's presence was like an off-key note, small, but impossible to ignore. The 12-year-old black girl stood beside a low wooden table, old but carefully cleaned. The table was just wide enough to hold a few boxes of light brown cookies. There was no advertising sign, only a small board that read, "One box, one heart," and the quiet patience of a little girl. Aubrey wore a thick beige coat, slightly oversized for her slim frame. Her canvas shoes were worn but clean. Her curly hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her face was calm, no forced smiles, no lowered gaze. Her wide, round eyes looked straight ahead, unusually steady, as if she had already braced herself for the stairs to come. And those stairs did come. People walking by slowed down for a brief second, then either kept walking as if she wasn't there, or furrowed their brows in disapproval. A woman in a fur coat paused, glanced at the cookie table, then clicked her tongue before turning away. An elderly man with silver hair, leaning on a cane, looked at Aubrey for a few seconds, then slowly shook his head. A young couple holding hands stretched their necks to look at her, then leaned toward each other and whispered with a concerned look. No one said anything aloud. But the air around them spoke clearly, "You don't belong here." Moments later, a security guard approached from the nearby shopping center. He wore a dark gray uniform, a radio on his shoulder, and walked with firm, deliberate steps. The sound of his leather shoes echoed sharply on the stone pavement. He stopped in front of the cookie table, squinted at Aubrey. His tone wasn't harsh, but it lacked any warmth. "What are you selling?" "This is a premium commercial zone." Aubrey looked up. She gave a short, gentle smile. Not awkward. Not defensive. Her voice was soft but steady, "I'm just selling for a little while. Then I'll go." The guard stared at her for a few seconds. His eyes wavered slightly. Maybe he had a daughter. Maybe he had seen kids like this trying to do something good in a world too big. Still, he shook his head, let out a quiet sigh, and muttered under his breath, "Kids these days, what are they thinking?" Then he walked away. No threats. No force. Just left her there, alone, standing in the middle of a plaza where people were judged by brand names and net worth. Aubrey turned back to her table, gently straightened one of the boxes, then kept standing. She didn't call out. She didn't ask anyone to stop. She simply stood there, as if she knew something greater was waiting ahead, and she, and only she, had the patience to wait for it to arrive. Around midday, as the sun shone brightly over Oak Ridge Square, a faint ripple of noise began to spread near the corner of the sidewalk where Aubrey stood. The breeze carried the scent of expensive perfume from passers-by, mixed with the aroma of food from the upscale cafe across the street. But amidst all the elegant motion, a group of 3 white teenage boys appeared, students from a private boarding school just a few blocks away. Their uniforms were crisply pressed, shoes spotless, leather backpacks slung over their shoulders. The way they walked radiated a kind of confidence bordering on arrogance, as if the entire street had been paved just for them. They stopped in front of Aubrey's small cookie table, giving it a look of confusion and narrowed eyes. One boy suddenly laughed out loud, making sure his voice was loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Is this some kind of fairytale sidewalk business?" His tone was half mocking, half joking, drawing laughter from the 2 others beside him. The second boy, taller, with slicked back blonde hair, pointed at one of the cookie boxes and said, "Probably used expired flour or something." As he spoke, he pretended to cover his nose, stepping back as if smelling something awful. A few adults nearby overheard the exchange. None stepped in. An older man raised an eyebrow and turned away. A woman in a white coat shook her head and scoffed softly before entering the Chanel boutique next door. No one spoke up for the girl. No one asked what was going on. They simply walked away, leaving a chill between bodies in the crowd. Aubrey kept standing tall. She didn't flinch. Her expression didn't change, only her voice softened slightly as she replied, "It's okay if you don't want to buy." The response was light, like a breeze, free of anger, free of resistance. But it was precisely that calmness that seemed to provoke the boys even more. Another boy immediately laughed, leaning forward, "It's okay, huh? Then what are you standing here for?" The question came out as a taunt, tinged with ridicule. He flung his hand toward the table as if trying to expose something ridiculous. All 3 boys burst out laughing, their voices echoing across what had been a quiet square. One of them pulled out his phone. No permission. No hesitation. He raised it and took a photo of Aubrey. Click. Then, while stepping back, he typed quickly on the screen, "Today's drama at Oak Ridge." The photo was uploaded instantly, accompanied by a short, mean-spirited caption. Just minutes later, the first comments began pouring in. Some criticized, some pitied, but most mocked. One comment stood out, "Where are her parents? Letting her stand out here like this." Another read, "Trying to get attention in the rich people's district." Aubrey saw the phone screen flash, but she said nothing. Her hand, resting on one of the cookie boxes, tensed slightly, then loosened. Her face remained composed, but in her eyes, a shadow of sadness had begun to creep in. No one noticed. No one stopped. The group of boys walked away, their laughter trailing behind them all the way down the street. And Oak Ridge returned to its hurried rhythm, as if nothing had ever happened. A shiny silver Bentley slowly rolled along the edge of the plaza. The surrounding crowd didn't even need to look to know who was inside, because a car like that belonged only to a very small circle in the city. The door opened, and a man stepped out with a confident stride and an air of pride. He was Franklin Pierce, a well-known real estate investor, once nicknamed the Golden Hand of Chicago. His charcoal gray overcoat, Italian silk tie, and polished leather shoes gleamed under the midday sun. Behind him followed 3 of his friends, all from the same class, speaking the same language, carrying that familiar look of people used to viewing the world from above. They had barely taken a few steps when Franklin's eyes paused at the corner of the sidewalk. He stopped, raised an eyebrow, and let out a faint smirk as if he had spotted a flaw in an otherwise perfect picture. Aubrey's little cookie table looked completely out of place in that high-end space, like an awkward detail in a luxurious design. He spoke loudly, without lowering his voice, "Someone's setting up a sidewalk stand here." His tone was both surprised and mocking, yet calm enough to seem like a casual remark. One of his friends burst out laughing and quipped, "What is this, training to get into Harvard?" The comment made the others laugh as well. They didn't bother hiding their contempt, nor did they pretend to be polite in front of a child. To them, this was just a strange little sideshow on a boring afternoon. Franklin took a few more steps, stopping right in front of Aubrey, barely an arm's length away. His eyes were sharp, staring straight at her without blinking. "Do you think you're doing something impressive?" he asked, his voice dropping, full of scrutiny. There was no real curiosity in his words, no care, only a silent declaration that the girl was out of line. Out of place. Out of class. Too different to belong. Aubrey stood still. She lowered her head, didn't respond. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew some answers were never truly heard. Her hand lightly touched the edge of the table, a small gesture to steady herself against the cold wind of his words. Franklin shook his head slightly, then glanced around. "Little girl, this is a place for global brands, not a playground for children." His words were deliberate, each one like a stone rolling over dry ground, landing with a hard, dry thud. His friends nodded in agreement, chuckling as if they had just witnessed a valuable life lesson. Without lingering, the group turned away. The sound of their shoes against the stone echoed in a steady rhythm. One of them pulled out a phone and recorded the moment, quickly uploading it to social media. The short clip came with a caption, "A girl with a strange dream." The video quickly gained views. The first comments appeared, many mocking, others laughing. Aubrey remained there. Silent. No explanation. No retreat. She only lowered her head a little more, to hide the heaviness forming in her eyes. Because she knew, this cold wind, was only the beginning. After the short video was posted online, the image of Aubrey selling cookies in the middle of Oak Ridge Square spread quickly. Within just a few hours, tens of thousands of views poured in. Most people weren't interested in the cookies. They were curious to see, with their own eyes, the little girl out of place among the elite who was now stirring up controversy on social media. Small groups of onlookers began to gather, forming a quiet crowd along the sidewalk. No one came to buy. They just stood and stared. A woman in her 40s, wearing large sunglasses and a white coat, crossed her arms as she faced the table. She made no attempt to hide her displeasure. Glancing from Aubrey's head to toe, she curled her lips and turned to the person beside her, speaking clearly enough for the girl to hear, "They should shut this down. It's an eyesore." Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp and cold, slicing through the air like a thin blade. Aubrey didn't respond. She simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes still looking straight ahead. A middle-aged man passed by with a coffee cup from the cafe nearby. He paused for a few seconds, furrowed his brows, then gently shook his head. "Kids these days are way too pampered," he muttered, half to himself, half for others to hear. He kept walking, not once looking back, leaving behind a comment colder than the late autumn breeze. A young man, around 20, wearing a hoodie and headphones, stared at Aubrey for a moment before nodding his chin toward her. "You poor or something? Where are your parents?" The question seemed harmless, but was filled with judgment. He didn't wait for an answer. Just gave her one more look, then walked off, eyes glued to his phone. Across the street, a little girl holding her mother's hand stopped and looked curiously at the cookie stand, eyes wide with the innocence of a child who had yet to learn how harsh the world could be. But her mother quickly tugged her forward, speaking in a low but firm voice, "Don't ever copy something that's strange." Her tone wasn't cruel, but the way she walked faster afterward made her caution unmistakable. Amid the growing weight of judgmental glances, the security guard returned. This time, his face was more serious. He wasn't rude or aggressive, but the firmness in his tone couldn't be ignored. "You should pack up. You're disrupting the commercial atmosphere here." Aubrey nodded gently. No resistance, no argument. Her reply was so soft it nearly vanished in the air. "Just 30 more minutes, please." Her voice made the guard hesitate. He looked at her for a moment, then turned and walked away without another word. The sun began to set. The warm light of late afternoon stretched across the stone pavement. The last rays of sunlight turned Aubrey's curly hair golden, reflecting off the neatly arranged cookie boxes on the table. But hardly anyone noticed. The crowd had started to thin. Those who remained merely passed by, as if the little girl and her wooden table had never been there. No one stopped. No one opened their wallet. Only Aubrey remained, quietly lifting her gaze to the changing sky, her hands gently holding the edge of the table, as if clinging to the last bit of hope left in a day that was almost gone. The sky gradually turned a pale shade of violet. The afternoon light fell softly like a thin veil, settling over the trees, the arched rooftops of luxury stores, and the small wooden table where Aubrey still stood motionless. Amid that quiet atmosphere, the sound of leather shoes echoed steadily, decisively. Franklin Pierce had returned. No group of friends accompanied him. No one followed behind to echo his presence. He walked alone, still cold in demeanor, but his gaze was sharper now, filled with clear intent. He stopped right in front of the cookie table, stood tall, hands in the pockets of his coat. Staring directly at the girl, he spoke loudly, half a sneer, half a command, "Still not leaving?" The question rang out in the near empty space, causing a few passing by to pause. They said nothing, just stood still, turning their heads toward the table. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes glimmered with the familiar curiosity of a crowd sensing something about to go too far. Franklin didn't wait for a reply. He reached out and picked up one of the cookie boxes, turning it lightly in his hands, squeezing both ends as if testing its firmness. Then he set it back down, not hiding the disappointment in his voice. "You think this counts as high quality?" A middle-aged woman walked by, her hair tied high, wearing a tight-fitting dress. She glanced at the scene and remarked bluntly, "The girl's probably trying to build her empire." Her words were followed by a sarcastic smile. She walked on, without looking back. But her comment lingered, hanging in the air like a scratch that wouldn't fade. Franklin glanced at Aubrey, then looked around at the onlookers. His voice lowered, yet rang clear as if meant for everyone to hear. "This girl is a prime example of modern-day delusion." He spoke slowly, each word sharp and distinct, like a short verdict delivered to a child who didn't know her place. A few people around him chuckled. No one laughed out loud, but small claps broke out, like an involuntary response to a public jab. No one thought they were contributing to something serious. It was just teasing. A little laughter. Nothing more. Aubrey remained still. Silent. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her stomach. Her eyes never left the table. Not because she didn't hear, but because she had heard it all too clearly. Each word landed like a pebble striking the fragile resolve inside her. In her eyes was something unclear, a blur between hurt and restraint. But not a single tear fell. From the back of the crowd, a young person raised a phone high. The camera pointed straight at Franklin and Aubrey. No introduction. No interview. Just a few seconds of footage to capture the moment. A short clip, quickly posted. The caption below read simply, "Cruel or just honest?" And within minutes, it began to spread. But Aubrey didn't know that yet. She just stood there, beneath the golden light of late afternoon, next to boxes of untouched cookies. No one bought. No one cared. And no one yet understood what she was truly holding onto inside. In a short amount of time, what had happened in Oakridge Square covered every local news site. On morning news feeds, a bold headline appeared on thousands of phone screens: "Black girl selling cookies faces discrimination at Oakridge." The photo attached showed Franklin holding up a cookie box while Aubrey stood silently, her head bowed. That image alone was enough to spark a wave of reactions across social media. Comments quickly split into two opposing sides. One side supported the girl, saying everyone had the right to make a living and that no one deserved to be humiliated for trying. The other side criticized her, calling it a publicity stunt, saying a child selling cookies in such a luxurious district was inappropriate and out of line. The comments formed an invisible barrier, pushing Aubrey into the middle of a controversy she never asked for. Amid all that, a group of well-dressed individuals appeared at the cookie table, holding folders in hand. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Oakridge High-End Residents Association. The man leading the group wore a silver badge and politely yet firmly asked Aubrey to pack up her stand. "Your presence is diluting the image of the district's brand," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes left no room for discussion. Aubrey didn't respond. She bowed her head slightly, as if used to this kind of polite but cold rejection. But she didn't move either. She stayed exactly where she was. Soon after, a group of TikTokers arrived. Stylishly dressed, cameras in hand, eyes lit with excitement. One of them stepped forward, leaned down, and asked with a cheerful tone, "Can you say a few words? We'll edit it nicely for you." Aubrey looked at them for a moment. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She shook her head. No words. No cooperation. One of them shrugged, "Maybe she's not allowed to speak," then they moved on, giggling as they filmed from another angle. Late afternoon. The wind began to pick up. A local government official appeared. He carried a stack of papers, glasses slipping down his nose, with the look of someone too familiar with handling side cases. He stopped in front of the cookie table, pulled out a printed notice, and said, "You're in violation of temporary business regulations on public space." His words landed like a tap on Aubrey's mind, though his voice was calm, free of blame. Everything seemed to be pressing down on the small girl. From social media to the real world. From mocking comments and indifference to administrative pressure. It was as if an invisible weight was trying to force her to give up, to walk away. But Aubrey didn't move. She stood still. No bowed head. No argument. Her hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, as if that line was the last thing she didn't want to lose. And then, just as everyone thought she was about to collapse, a strange sound echoed from the main road. A sleek black SUV slowly pulled up to the sidewalk. Its headlights reflected in the eyes of the people standing nearby. The car stopped, its door opened slowly. Every gaze turned toward it. No one knew what was about to happen. But maybe, this wasn't just Aubrey's fight anymore. The door of the black SUV slowly opened, and stepping out was a woman dressed in a deep navy blue suit. Her figure was elegant, her steps light yet firm. Pinned to her chest was a badge that read, "National Health Organization." Her hair was neatly tied back, her gaze clear and composed. She didn't glance around much, nor did she seem surprised by the crowd. Her eyes went directly to the small cookie table where Aubrey still stood, silent under the last rays of sunlight. The woman walked closer, stopping right in front of the girl. She gently bowed her head, smiled, then asked in a soft but warm voice, "Ready, sweetheart?" No explanation, no need for context, the words alone were enough to make the air pause. In her voice was familiarity, pride, and something far deeper. The crowd stirred. Some tilted their heads. A few took a step back. But the woman paid no attention. She turned to face everyone. Her voice was not loud, but it carried clearly and evenly, I'd like to announce that this young girl is the official representative for the National Cancer Research fundraising campaign." The words swept through the plaza like a cold wave cutting through the already tense atmosphere. All whispers stopped instantly. The probing looks became hesitant. No one laughed. The entire crowd fell silent. In the distance, Franklin Pierce stood still. He was partially hidden behind a tree, only a few meters away, but at that moment, it felt like he was completely isolated. His face showed unmistakable shock. His legs wouldn't move forward. His hands clenched in his coat pockets, trembling slightly. He had likely never imagined that the girl he once mocked could hold such a place. A middle-aged man standing at the edge of the crowd quietly asked, as if speaking to no one, "Who is this girl?" No one answered. But the woman heard him. She turned back, looked directly into the eyes now fixed on her, and said slowly, "And she is the daughter of diamond tycoon Miles Pierce." Her words hit the crowd like a jolt to the chest. Soft gasps rose around. Some people raised hands to their mouths. Others craned their necks to get another look at Aubrey, as if needing to confirm what they just heard. That small face, the simple curls, the worn coat, suddenly looked entirely different. Aubrey remained still. But this time, the stares were no longer laced with disdain. No longer driven by curiosity. They were looks of embarrassment, of astonishment, of confusion. Because now, everyone understood that from this moment on, she was no longer a misfit in Oak Ridge. She was the center. And no one knew quite how to face that. Just as silence settled over Oak Ridge Square, the massive LED screen at the center suddenly lit up. The first flashes of light broke through the dimming evening air, making the crowd flinch and look up. A voice came through the loudspeakers, clear and resolute. On the screen appeared a familiar face. The curly hair, the small face, the steady gaze, it was Aubrey. She was standing on the stage of a large auditorium, with the logo of the National Cancer Research Foundation behind her. The hall was full. Every seat taken. All eyes were fixed on the stage, as if awaiting something truly important. The host's voice rang out with pride, "Please welcome Aubrey Pierce, the youngest person ever to launch the Cookies for Cure campaign." The words echoed across the square, freezing everyone in place. The eyes of those who had once mocked her widened. Some raised their hands to cover their mouths. A few looked down, avoiding the gaze of those beside them. The screen continued to play a short video. Footage showed Aubrey and her friends baking cookies, boxing them, labeling them, and walking door to door through small neighborhoods to seek support. Numbers began appearing slowly, over $50,000 raised in just 3 months. No major sponsors. No flashy media coverage. Just small cookies and an unwavering spirit from a girl not yet 12. Franklin stood still in the crowd. His eyes locked on the screen. His mouth slightly open, his breath slowed. His entire body seemed rooted to the ground. Every word he had said, every mocking tone, every dismissive shrug now returned to him like sharp cuts in his mind. He had nothing to say. And he had no idea how to face his daughter. A reporter at the event raised their hand and asked, "Aubrey, why didn't you tell people your true purpose? Why didn't you share your campaign from the beginning?" A simple question, yet it made the hall grow even more silent. Aubrey stepped gently toward the microphone. She smiled. Not shy. Not hesitant. Her answer came softly and calmly, "I wanted to do it for the right reason, not for praise." The room paused for a few seconds. Then applause erupted. Long, thunderous, not from surprise, but from deep emotion. Back at Oak Ridge Square, no one laughed. No one whispered. Everyone stood still. Some looked down. Others looked at the little girl with entirely different eyes. And Aubrey, still beside her worn cookie table, stood bathed in the glow of the evening light, radiant in a peaceful way. She didn't need to say anything more. Because at last, the truth had spoken for itself. The sky had darkened. The lights around the square began to turn on, casting a warm golden glow onto the stone-paved ground. It was no longer just a forgotten corner. Aubrey's cookie table had become a spot for charity, drawing attention from many. A small sign now stood at the front, clearly stating the purpose: fundraising for cancer research. The cookie boxes were neatly arranged, more purposeful than ever. From a distance, Franklin Pierce began to approach. Gone was the proud stride. His steps were slow, his hands loose at his sides. He walked toward the table, where his daughter still stood, calm eyes, a face without blame. No cameras. No reporters. Just a father and a little girl who had been misunderstood by the world. Franklin stopped in front of Aubrey. A quiet moment passed. Then he bowed his head. His voice was low, slightly trembling, so unlike the man he had been before. "I'm sorry, for not knowing you were doing something so meaningful." Aubrey looked at him for a few seconds. No judgment. No hesitation. She gently placed a cookie in his hand, then softly said, as if just between the two of them, "It's okay, just support me by buying one." The words were simple, but carried the weight of true forgiveness. A man who had once belittled her now stood silently, holding a cookie. No more words were spoken. But in that moment, something inside both of them began to mend. As if led by some unseen signal, people started to come closer. One by one, they quietly lined up in front of the table. No more curiosity, no more condescending glances. They came to support. To make up for it. Some bought one box. Some bought 10. Others just looked, then slipped a few bills into the donation box. But all of them wore a genuine look of respect. Among the quiet crowd, an elderly man with white hair leaned on a crutch. His eyes were faded, but he still saw Aubrey's face clearly. He nodded gently, then said loud enough for all to hear, "Small girl, but a big heart." That sentence rang louder than applause. It reached beyond praise, touching something deeper, a kind of admiration that needs no explanation. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines began to appear: 12-year-old girl moves a city with her steadfast spirit. From a simple wooden table, proof that love still exists in the city. Mocked and misunderstood, then made everyone rethink themselves. And Aubrey, she was still standing there. Still wearing that soft smile. She didn't need anything more. Because today, she had changed something. Not just with cookies. But by living honestly, persistently, and without resentment. Sometimes, what wounds the deepest isn't direct insult, but the quiet disregard, the condescending glances, or a stranger's arrogant shrug. Aubrey didn't respond with anger. She chose silence. And somehow, it was that silence that made people listen. Aubrey's story isn't just about cookies. It's proof that resilience, kindness, and the right intentions will always have a place, even in a world quick to judge. You don't have to be grown up to do something great. You don't need status to create value. What matters is whether you dare to step forward, to believe in what you're doing, even when surrounded by doubt and resistance. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe you've been misunderstood. But don't let that take away what's good in you. Keep doing the right thing. Even if others don't understand yet. Because in the end, the truth will speak for itself. If this story touched something in your heart, please share the video to spread the message. Leave a comment about what you've learned from Aubrey. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Excellence for more inspiring stories that move hearts.